there's a different reason why somebody doesn't switch the lights off when they go out or the air conditioning off when they go to work than why a paper maker might not have the latest process in their factory. So these are very different problems and so on. Now, when it comes to utilities, their fundamental model is they sell electricity and that's how they make money. And so it's very difficult. You can regulate, you can try and incentivize them to do something different. But the fundamental model is the more you sell, the more money you make. And you've got to somehow change that if you want them to be on side.
Do you see the new smart grids helping this process, or is there something more needed?
Well, smart grids are partly about empowering the consumer because think about your electricity bill and compare it to your phone bill. So your phone bill 20 years ago just said, here it is, this $200 this quarter, whatever. And that's pretty much the way your electricity bill is now. A smart grid or a smart meter would make your electricity bill much more like your phone bill. This is the text that you sent, this is the phone call, this is where you called, this is what time. By the way, you can now work out how to save money. So that's part of what smart grids do, but you do need the utility. A lot of the real value, partly it's about the consumers saving electricity, knowing more, but partly it's about the utility being able to manage the whole network more efficiently. So, for instance, they'll have a really inefficient plant that they use for peak demand. They don't want to use it too much because it's inefficient. Now, if they could switch off your freezer for 3 minutes, you'll never notice. But if that means they don't have to cut that plant in, then we've got energy efficiency. So if you look at that, those two things, energy savings and shifting the demand, the utility wants to do the demand shifting. They don't necessarily want you to save the electricity, though.
So how do we persuade them to do that, governments?
Well, I think there's only two things you can do. Three things you can do, actually. You can regulate. You can tell them that they have to do certain things. So they have to run a program to help you invest in insulation or in upgrading your appliances. The other thing you could do is decouple. You could say, well, we're going to pay you. You're going to actually make more money by selling less electricity. So what you're going to sell is some proxy lighting services, call it, so that you're not actually motivated to sell more electricity, more kilowatt hours. The way you do this, it could be that you have a penalty for, if you look at how many households you serve, how much electricity they use, and each year you say, well, if the average is above X, you'll pay a penalty such that, in fact, you're being motivated to sell less and less rather than more and more. So it can be done. There are programs, there are utilities, there are states in the US where they're decoupling in that way, but it's quite hard because the sort of natural human, the animal spirits of the managers, even in the utilities, is, I want to innovate, I want to grow, I want to, increase demand for my product. And so, what you have to do is redefine the product, in a sense, to be efficient use of electricity and not just more electricity.
Can I ask you about the intermediate actors, people like Good Energy in the UK who have a green agenda? Can they make a difference, or do you have to go back to the utilities?
Well, I think you've got to go back, if you want to do all of this stuff, I think you've got to go back to the regulator. Good Energy is wonderful, but they are a utility themselves. Now, they want to sell more green energy. They would rather, you decide to use wind energy. And in fact, there's a program that's been launched here called WindMade, which is all about giving the consumer the ability to know that this cappuccino was made using wind energy, and therefore they could request that, and they can actually express some demand. And of course, that would very much benefit Good Energy in the UK, because they would then have more demand for their sorts of services. In fact, they could even get that WindMade kite mark themselves potentially. And that's a program that was launched to the business community, not yet to the consumer, here in Davos, and we're a data provider. We're very much behind that and so on. But I think that ultimately you need robust action from the regulator to say, to the utilities, this is how you're going to implement smart grid so that all the incentives are transparent to the users and they can reduce their demand and so on. Or you decouple. And I was going to say there is a third way, which is to use these technologies for dramatic deregulation. So if you look at what happened in telecoms from the 80s onwards, was actually using the technology to enable new players to come in. And that's something that smart grid technologies allow. Let me give you an example. You could buy a fridge plus all the electricity that it's ever going to consume from John Lewis. the technology is there to track the use of electricity from that fridge, one example. Another one might be to say, well, I want to buy energy from EDF during the day, but at night I want to buy cheap green electricity from a Scandinavian generator, which will come through some other pipe. And all of the ability to do that, or to set up some protocols as a consumer, you'll probably just pull a slider bar on a website once and then forget it for 5 years. But you can offer new services which bring in new providers, and they will help to compete the price of energy and the price of clean energy down. So, but you do need robust action by the regulators. The regulator is the key player here.
And can I ask you about feed-in tariffs, which encourage consumers to put in their own forms of renewable energy? Are they working?
Well, feed-in tariffs is a whole PhD thesis on its own. I think that the beauty of them is the simplicity. You know what you get when you generate power. The devil is in the detail of, it is essentially it's a state intervention in pricing. So it's somebody setting a price. And we know, because this is what we do at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, that whilst you degress the feed-in tariff in some nice rational way every year, we know that the price of modules actually fluctuates on a much shorter time frame. So it's not just that in Spain, for instance, in 2008, or in Italy in 2010, or wherever it is this year, that they've got the price wrong. If only we had the perfect central planning price setter. The problem is that it is actually an impossible car to drive. It is actually impossible to get a feed-in tariff at exactly the right rate so that there's just enough of a frenzy to get the developers developing, but not so much that they don't go crazy and add gigawatts and gigawatts very quickly, which they can. And the problem is, so then you say, well, you don't want gigawatts and gigawatts. What you do is you'll say, okay, we'll have a cutoff, 500 megawatts, a gigawatt, whatever you want. But then there's a race. So now you don't just have a frenzy, you have more of a frenzy over a shorter time period. So it's extremely difficult to drive that car. It tends to jerk and accelerate and slow and stop, and people get rich. And that is, I think, extremely dangerous and difficult for the sector. So I think that for the residential market, it's probably the only way to go, because you need the simplicity of saying to the retail consumer, this is what you'll get. If you put panels on your roof, this is what you get. For the projects, the bigger investments, you probably want some sort of tendering system where you say, we will approve the cheapest 500 megawatts or the cheapest gigawatt of bids. And then they get a rate that persists for 15, 20 years so they can plan on it. But you don't have this kind of rush of developers. Where's the next best destination? If Italy blows up, where should we go next? And I think that's very damaging for the industry, the way that it's worked out.
Can I ask you one more question as well about domestic appliances? Why do you feel the standards for appliances in the home are so important as well?
So there's a whole class of decisions around energy consumption where the consumer doesn't have the information or is perhaps buying a piece of capital equipment which they then use, and it's sort of too late even if they have the information at that point. So you've really got to look at, for a class of decisions, what you really want is that first decision. What car do you buy is much more important than whether you fill the tyres with air or not. I mean, that's important too, but you've got, it's much better to buy a small car than a big car. And so similarly on appliances, it's much better to buy the right washing machine, and then whether you do your laundry this many times or that many times is subordinate. The problem is that the consumers find it very difficult to evaluate the full lifetime cost of a washing machine or of a fridge. It's just too difficult to think, well, will I be in the same house for 20 years? And what happens if the kids come home from college? And so on. So what you need to do is just to say, look, you know what? We will just make life simple for you. This is what a fridge has to do. This is what a washing machine has to do. And potentially in industry, you could see a similar thing. You could say, well, this is what a packaging line has to do, or this is what, there are standardized pieces of equipment that are used in industry after industry, paper making, steel, cement, all sorts. And you can set standards and say, right, after this year, after 2015, after 2020, it is simply not acceptable to either use or sell, depends on the sector, inefficient equipment. And buildings is another one where you need that sort of approach. You have a building developer that wants to get the building up, get the tenants in, and move on. and they don't have the same incentive to make sure that the building is as energy efficient as possible. And so I think you need to intervene and say, right, this many watts per square meter, this many watts per cubic meter, whatever you want to do, and really regulate and make sure that and then hold the developer to it, because you're just not going to shift the supertanker fast enough otherwise.
So at the end of the day, are you pessimistic or optimistic about our prospects?
I'm enormously optimistic about the ultimate destination. Right? I think that what we're seeing is an energy system that's moving from centralized, dumb, insecure, inefficient to decentralized, smart, secure, efficient. And I think that will take 30 to 50 years. I would love it to take 10 to 30 years. So I'm optimistic about the destination, but I think in terms of what we should be thinking about is acceleration. And we should be thinking about looking at those interventions that matter now versus those that we can leave a little bit longer. Because, there is so much to do that it's actually daunting. But, if we keep on line up the targets and shoot them down and line them up and shoot them down, then I think we could accelerate this process considerably.